Hi, welcome back to This Week at TAG, brought to you by me, Steve Bowden, and the Archmage at Greenwood.
Thank you for joining us this week.
First up, we have some interesting news about The Whispering Skull by Ed Greenwood, a novel based on the board game Folklore, The Affliction.
That's right. The Whispering Skull is now available on Amazon and Kobo in ebook format. And we have the trade paperback version available through Onder Emporium and Amazon.
To celebrate this news, we have a special reading of the first chapter of the novel by Ed Greenwood himself.
The Whispering Skull, Chapter 1, Howls in the Trees. Another eerie howl arose in the gloomy woods behind him. Closer than the last, of course. It was answered from even nearer at hand. From somewhere on the far side of the deep valley, Brand New flanked the road on his right hand, his sword hand. The wolves were bad this year. The wolves were bad every year. The wolves, Jantis Brand growled under his breath, eyeing the gloomy trees, leaning over the muddy road that he and his pack beast were walking alone, are bad and getting worse. Old Trusty flicked an ear at that. The old mule didn't like growls, no matter which throat they came from. On, trust of us, Brand told it, trying to sound as firm and comforting as he knew how. Not much farther now. On. He eyed the darkening sky as he spoke. Clouds, like dirty gray, tattered banners shredded by long ghost talons, stretched clear across the cold heavens in an untidily forbidding tapestry, and hoped he'd make the black stag before nightfall. It was a hope as cold and thin as the chill wind rising at his back. They were plodding, he and his mule. They were both cold and hungry and tired. Tired beyond tired. Tired out. And no wonder. Neither of them had dared to stop beyond a few snatched moments to gulp water from a stream that spilled across the deserted road back at Galarshall's for a day and a night, on top of a long day of walking and fighting before that. Yes, fighting. Peddlers like Brand often had to fight snatch thieves, but that was a matter of sprinting and a few hard and sometimes vicious punches, not swords out. Except that it had been blades bared this time. Which was why he was on the road alone, when peddlers were usually wise enough to travel in trios or more. Poor Raldrus had been left to the vultures and wolves back at Ulksbridge. Brand and Ottomer had been too busy fighting off hamstringing attempts on their mules by outlaws of seemingly endless number to bury their old trail friend. Besides, Raldrus, throat slit from ear to ear, had been past minding how what was left of him got treated. They made it to Thomond, with Ottomer groaning and hunched over a hacked-apart hand, and his mule lame and badly cut about, too. So in Thomond, old Ottomer bided now, in the cheapest room they'd been able to find, trying to heal. Leaving Brand to trade on alone, on into Kreml, with the summer drawing down. The winter ahead bade fair to be a hard one. Brand mainly dealt in goods wanted in all seasons, thread and waxed cord, bone buttons and small mongery, tools and knives and gate-catch hook and eye fastenings. Unless sales were brisk, he always had a good-sized array. He had one now. That stout a cargo of such wares wasn't light, and sure-footed trust of us wasn't young. Brand couldn't push it to go farther. His faithful beast was plodding along as fast as it could, neither dawdling nor complaining, hating the wet and the cold every bit as much as its master, and wanted to be out of the weather just as badly as Brand did. Yet, wanting to be at the Stag didn't bring it any closer. It was the only inn on the lonely stretch between Thomond and Wayland Point, not quite halfway between. Which did not, Brand reflected grimly, looking again at the sky, which if it stayed like this would bring darkness sooner than the setting sun, make it near enough. His stomach rumbled, and as if in reply, so did his mule's. Come to think of it, his throat was parched. Another howl, from off to the left this time, and nearer. Not that he dared do anything about either thirst or hunger beyond bending to catch up and swallow a handful of snow. Stopping to dine and drink would be less than prudent about now, for the wolves were hungry too. It had been a bad year, with outlaws raiding out of the woods along the southern roads, and the wolves prowling ever more boldly in the north. Everyone said the wolves were bad this year. Not a day passed without talk of some new mauling or eyes by night looking in windows no wolf would normally be bold enough to go anywhere near. Some of the howling hunters had grown fearless enough to stroll through the hearts of large towns from dusk to dawn, and gather in nearby fields even on the brightest, fairest days, with many folk out and about. It was worse in Kreml, folk said, and he was walking into Kreml right now. And it seemed all the talk had been right, for the local pack was padding after Brand, outflanking him on both sides, closing in. There had always been wolves in these dark forests. They usually took weak or sick deer, and sometimes sheep and goats when the deer grew scarce, or in the cold heart of winter when smaller meals were asleep deep in hiding and the wolf packs were going hungry. But this year's wolves, these large, lean, black-furred beasts with red-gold eyes that went red when they attacked, these wolves were different. This had always been a lonely road, but since the Lomond, it had been deserted. Brand had seen no one at all. Perhaps the wolves had something to do with that. He wore boots of his own making, clumsy-looking things, because he was no corviser, but they had good hard toes as well as the usual hobnails, and flared, back-curving metal spine plates that rose above the backs of his knees and should help guard against hamstringings. Yet, Trusty had no such protection, and wolves that found no joy in going for the backs of a peddler's knees would likely merely shift to arms and hands and throat. Stop filling yourself with good cheer, Gentis Brand, he reproved himself aloud, and checked the sky again. A sudden chill wind was rising at his back, plucking up and whirling dead leaves past him. Above, the talons were crossing the sky faster, as if rushing to be in it a kill. A kill, Brand fervently wished, would happen elsewhere. This was a wild stretch at the best of times, with an occasional woodcutter's trail or clearing, but nary an overgrown ruin to seek rude shelter in, let alone a steading. It was just him and his mule and the wolves. There came a rustling in the trees then, hard by on his right, a crashing of trampled dead leaves and a snapping of dead branches. Brand turned to face the din, not slowing his steady plod onward, and clapped hands to the hilts of his sword and his favorite knife, the one he was getting better at throwing. A dark figure burst into view, cloaked and hooded, sword in hand. Oh, great. Outlaws. Brand cast quick glances all about, looking for the rest of them. Leaping from all sides, that was the way of it, the way outlaws usually... But there came no others, and the lone man with the sword was staggering now, stumbling out into the road, to crash down on his face, sword cartwheeling from his hand. He struggled to rise, twisting desperately over on his side to reach that emptied hand beseechingly up at Brand, and then sank down with a sort of wheezing groan and lay still. His other hand fell away from his throat, and Brand realized the man had been clutching it all this while. Trustivus snorted and broke into a clumsy trot, smelling blood. Brand left the mule's side just long enough to take a few quick strides closer to the fallen man to peer, and then to pluck up the outlaw's sword, which proved to be a worn but wickedly sharp butcher's cleaver, of good heavy iron. It felt solid and usefully dangerous in his hand. God be thanked, he muttered. A free sword was a free sword. He hastened back to Trusty, as a wolf howled from back in the trees not far behind where the outlaw had emerged. The outlaw who'd been clutching the bitten open ruin of his own throat. The wolves were hungry, all right. Brand felt like slapping his mule to keep it trotting, but Trusty was back to plodding, a swaying, exhausted gait now. He was watching a mule stagger. Trustivus wasn't going to make it to the stag. Brand cursed feelingly, then turned on his heels as he walked, in a spin that let him look in all directions. So he saw the separate moments when wolves trotted calmly out of the trees into view, their eyes fixed on him. There, and over there, and now a third, likely the one who'd just howled, on his left, to his right, and behind him. More of them there now, the whole pack spilling out onto the road to follow him. Trusty snorted again, and it sounded somehow both fearful and exasperated, like a grim curse. Brand found himself chuckling. The wolves drew in closer. Not chasing yet, not quite. More like herding, following patiently, awaiting their best chance to take down peddler and mule without getting hurt. Not one of them had paused for a single moment to feed on, or even examine, the fallen outlaw. "So," Brand said aloud, "wolves of taste and discernment." His voice drew all wolf eyes that were turning red. "Wonderful," Brand growled. "God be with me now." The road crested a little rise and then descended sharply to a wet muddiness ahead where the most modest of creeks crossed the cartway. Perhaps the high ground of the rise might have been the best place to make a stand, but there wasn't a shadow's worth of cover. The wolves could come leaping in at him from all sides. Besides, Trusty was already past the height and hurrying down towards the road, snorting and breaking out into a real fear sweat. So, this was it. The place he was most likely going to die. As he hastened to catch up to Trusty, Brand shot more swift glances back behind. All of the wolves had picked up their pace to match his, loping along with an eager grace, red eyes fixed on him, hungrily. It was growing noticeably darker, but he could still see clearly, enough to spot the glimmer of water just off to the left, where the creek widened into some sort of pond. Nearer, nearer, he could see dead, drowned trees standing like sentinels in inky water, footing that had to be worse for a wolf trying to spring than dry, solid ground. A trifling advantage, but he'd take it. Brand broke into a run, grabbed firm hold of Trusty's bridle rather than trusting the strength of the old lead rein, and hauled hard to the left, running and pulling for all he was worth, which wasn't much just now, but snorting and tossing its head, but not complaining as badly as Brand had feared it might, the mule veered with him. It might balk upon reaching the actual dark water and being unable to see footing, and for that matter, Brand himself might then be stumbling or falling on slimy, slippery underwater rocks he couldn't see. But he highly suspected such things would very shortly be among the very least of his problems. And splash, 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 slip, splash! Snort, buck, confused, kicking tree topple, splash! They were in the water, and slipping and sliding continually on slick, underseen, rotting boughs and saplings drowned underfoot, sinking into and churning up a muck of rotting, slimy leaves and decay that let loose a choking, charnel-midden reek that made Bran's gorge rise despite the peril. He was trying to turn before they got really stuck, or charged on into watery depths where they'd have to swim. This widening of the creek was certainly large enough to be a real pond. A long-dead sapling had fallen at their arrival, and mud and icy water were flying, and turned to face the wolves. "Turn, curse you!" He didn't realize he shouted that aloud until one of the wolves, they were charging now, coming at him in an eager rush with long fangs gleaming, barked some sort of defiant reply, and sprang. Bran's newfound outlaw sword came in immediately useful. He trusted in its heavy sturdiness to chop viciously backhanded at the wolf's snout, by the open gates of hell at its gaping maw, and half slice, half smash its head aside, and then sink his knife into its throat. All he had to do was thrust in. The force of the hunter's leap, as it burst past, dragged open its neck in a long, ragged gash. A moment later, it had shouldered him heavily aside and was gone, into the pond beyond, with an almighty crash and fountaining of waters. Trusty was shrieking in anger and fear and lashing out with hooves that caught a smaller wolf in the face and bowled it over backwards, and thudded home heavily into the chest and ribs of another. Brand hadn't time to see more. Though he was slashing and stabbing like a madman, snapping, snarling jaws were everywhere, trying for his legs and arms and throat. Buffeted and stumbling, Brand kicked down, trying above all to keep his feet and not get flung over and back into the waters with half a dozen of the beasts atop him. If that befell, they'd be crowding each other to get at his throat, slamming each other aside to try and take his life. 2 wolves slammed into him at once, and he was driven staggering backwards. But they'd both been leaping, not planted, so twisting sideways as he gave way was enough to spill one of them down into the waters. Brand was already slipping, so he sacrificed his balance in an odd sort of hop that brought him down hard on the fallen wolf with both knees, and felt something give under his left knee. Then he got that left foot planted and spun to drive the outlaw sword into the ribs of a wolf that was somehow worse, that had just locked its jaws on his knife forearm. God, they stank. A rank musk that was somehow worse than the fetor of the pond muck. Ugh! He clawed and snarled and roared out his fear and fury as he stabbed and hacked and stabbed, trying to keep them away from his legs and throat, and they were weighing down his arms again, and Trustivus let out a bubbling roar of rage, like nothing Brand had ever heard a mule voice before, and sprang atop a rolling, snapping wolf, hoofs thudding, trampling the beast, surging to bring its feet crashing down again and again. A wolf sprang at it from behind, seeking to hamstring, and the mule turned with a speed that told Brand it had been watching for this, and laid open the side of that wolf's head with one lashing hoof. The wolf tumbled away to splash down far out across the pond, and left behind only bubbles. Brand spared no more time for checking his rear, but flung himself face down, pinning the wolves on his arms beneath him, twisted free to stab them ruthlessly until they rolled away shrieking, and got up to stagger back and catch his breath. Suddenly, there were no more wolves biting or springing at him, which was a good thing, because he was right out of breath, and drenched, muddy, and bloody to boot. 4 wolves were down, and the rest were bleeding or limping as they circled hastily away out of reach, to growl at him from a safe distance like so many chained in-yard dogs. Something inside Gentis Brand was pleased to see that the wolves considered something like a good dozen running paces to be a safe distance from him. That just might win him time enough to get his wind back. Because, unlike some fireside tale or other, no one was coming in the proverbial angel's nick of time to to rescue him or Trusty. They were on their own out here, in the bleak, cold, uncaring wild forest, with night coming down and at least a dozen wolves determined to take them. Being as he was already wet, and because he was bloody-minded enough to want to show the wolves calm defiance, he took the time to wash the worst of the blood off his face and hands and blades, then took Trusty's bridle again as if nothing at all had happened, and squelched his way back to the road, wet through and hurting in a dozen places. It was still a long way to the Black Stag, and night was fast coming down. He stalked on, trying not to show his growing limp, and showed the wolves his back, as if he had nothing more to fear from them. And perhaps God, or the angels, had sent him aid, because when snapping and snarling arose behind him and he turned quickly to wave the outlaw sword warningly, he found he had nothing to menace. The hungry wolves were fighting each other to be first at the feast, devouring their dead fellows. They were 2 rises and 7 bends of the road beyond the pond before his looks back showed him wolves once more, padding patiently after him like grim soldiers on the march, silent and malevolent, their eyes like so many lanterns in his wake. And so ends chapter 1.
We're very literary this week because, as we promised also earlier, we also have another reading from All Things Through the Bright Flames.
From my Mert tale, All Things Through the Bright Flames. The saffron fields rose up into the air like a great golden sleeping giant's belly, inland of Ormpur to the northeast. They ended to the south where the worm bones began, a rocky ridge that rose swiftly into a line of short but jagged steep mountains that marched away east and southeast into unseen distances. Ormpurans mined nither in the worm bones, and grew the saffrara, the saffron crocus flowers, in their fields of gold. The saffron lands climbed high and steeply enough that the flower fields were visible from almost everywhere in the city, a great hump rising above and behind the loftiest spires and domes. Ormpurans had their sentinels watching the precious saffron flowers at all times, against thieves and blundering beasts coming out of the shar. But every family that owned a plot walked and worked it daily, so the several wagon roads and many foot trails ascending the slope were always busy by daylight, except in the brief and cold wet season, when driving rains made everything liquid mud, better left undisturbed. Over the centuries, the fields had become a habitual place for many Ormpurans to meet and confer with fellow family members, but had become frowned upon as a place for visitors to meet, thanks to the ever-present temptation to harvest samples, ready or not, small thefts that nibbled away at yields. Young children in Ormpur grew up expert slingers, for it was their task to take down any bird or rodent that might want to sample a crocus flower. Yet the tracks and wagon roads themselves, not to mention the trade roads to Shirtaler and Durlask, remained popular for walking talks, wherein those who desired fresh air or a smoke, as they strolled along conducting meetings with others, populated the muddy tracks, making deals, gossiping, and carry on conversations safely distant from ears they would prefer didn't have the chance to listen in. So when Iltrim Galavrath arrived with Rethdag to have his employer, the esteemed merchant Uldru, meet with him for a walking talk on matters of mutual mercantile interest, Aldrew considered the invitation safe enough, so long as he had 3 hulking hired bodyguards along, trudging between and behind their client and Glavrath, and glowering warningly at Glavrath every few paces. "We can speak freely in front of them," Aldrew assured Mert with the crookedest smile Mert had seen in a long time. "I've paid for their utmost discretion." Mert nodded. Given the needles he was carrying, he wasn't all that worried about the mountainous glowerers. He was more concerned about the weasel-like Restag, who would certainly be skulking somewhere nearby, and the eyes each gang leader had without doubt set to watching his every wheeze. They turned from one of the foot trails onto the trade road to Durlusk, which hosted far fewer rumbling wagons and fast coaches than the road south to Shir Talar, so they could hear themselves think, and should have to scramble aside less often, and encounter far fewer piles of steaming ox dung. This, thought Mert, was ideal. Being out here in the fields made it harder for armies of eavesdroppers to lurk near enough to overhear, as it was only in tavern tales, and when dealing with the Zentarim or the Red Wizards in times when either were riding high, that the sort of spies private citizens could afford had powerful magic to listen in from afar, or transform listeners into mice or make them invisible so they could get cozily near. "So now," Mert began affably, "as you may or may not know, I've just returned here after spending some time in Durance Vile, in Waterdeep, which is a simply wonderful place for making deals, above board and otherwise. My face and name are rather too well known in Waterdeep Castle right now for me to succeed nimbly in the less well-lit corners of trade in the deep, so it occurred to me that if I could find someone who buckled the right swash, so to speak, but wasn't personally notorious in the City of the Splendors, someone such as yourself, say?" Mert glanced past the man-mountain Aldrew had hired to lurch along between them, and gave Aldrew a sly smile, which the merchant gleefully returned through the biggest, bushiest, buck-rawless mustache Mert had ever seen, and he was a man who'd sported a mustache of respectable dimensions himself a time or two. This was a mouth-muff big enough to store a fish in. "I've always interested in hearing trading proposals involving Waterdeep," Aldrew replied smoothly. "A mercantile crossroads where more coin changes hands in a shipping season than in a dozen seasons here. What trader interested in flourishing success could turn away, leaving such opportunities unheard, Indeed, Mert agreed. However, Aldrew interrupted in a harsher voice, stepping back so he was now behind all 3 bodyguards, who lurched together, hip to hip, to form a solid and menacing wall of hulking flesh, all worn leather crisscrossed by straps and baldricks, and festooned with dangling plates of rusty salvaged armor. "I am more than a little suspicious of any offer made to me by a doppelganger." Mert grunted, genuinely astonished. "What doppelganger?" "You, Garlacher. You see, I happen to have known Iltrim Glavrath rather well. We did quite a bit of covert business together, right under Berithru Telmunder's nose, and I remember very well how Early talked. I also recall that we didn't part on the best of terms, because I owed him several hundred gold, never mind why, and he decided to claim that debt back by thieving my best coach and the horses when he left for Waterdeep, even though he was sailing. You don't talk like him, and you don't seem to know anything about the bellowed argument that went on when we saw each other last, as the ship sailed away and the water grew wider between us, pleasantries that culminated in both of us promising to kill the other when next we met. In short,
You are not Glavrath. And being as the only doppelganger who dares to stick its non-existent nose into Thaith affairs here in Onder is Brawl Garlacher of the Dark Wind.
3 hands the size of shovels dug into belt pouches and came up with bone tubes, blowpipes. Mert knew he had only seconds to live. He started flinging needles and racing to one side, heading around one end of the line of bodyguards so as to put one of them in the way of the others blowing deadly darts at him. As he did so, he caught sight of 2 men who'd been walking separately along the road behind them in the same direction they were heading. The more distant one, now running back to Onder just as fast as his little legs could carry him along, which was very fast, Mert had no difficulty in recognizing as Restag, Uldru's tame sneak thief. The nearer one was an unfamiliar local Ormpuran, sandaled and in the usual oversmock and breeches, just in the act of turning to run after Restag, and dropping to all fours as he did so, his arms and legs transforming into leonine limbs. So, if doppelgangers were as rare as all that in Onder, this must be Garlacher, spying for the Dark Wind to make sure Glavrath did his killing, or trying to make sure Glavrath died trying. Garlacher had been furious when Bralak had ordered him out of the room. If he made it back to the city and told Bralak of all of this, Tymora cursed them. He didn't have time for all these assailants just now. One at a time with your turn, Tymora, take you, he roared. And of course, right then was when, Tymora having the sense of humor she so evidently did, a fast coach came rumbling out of the Shar from Durlusk. At top speed, the drovers whipping their team of 8 fast horses and trailing a cloud of dust. They were stopping for no one, which was bad news for Uldru's hired bodyguards. 2 were down already, thanks to Mert's needles, and the 3rd was stumbling like a drunkard as the coach bore down on them, with drovers yelling and blowing way horns, and Uldru scrambled for his life. Mert watched the rattling conveyance come with narrowed eyes, trying to judge just the right moment, and hoping the crash that was going to happen right in front of his eyes when the coach hit the downed men wouldn't cause a wild wreck, because he was going to need this coach to have the slightest hope of catching Garlacher, and doing that might just be the key to getting out of today alive.
The Ed Greenwood group will be going through even more changes this coming year.
To effectively focus on bringing you great new content, we'll be undergoing more restructuring. What that will entail exactly, you'll find out in the upcoming weeks.
But what we can tell you is that we do have a loose schedule of releases planned for next year.
In January and February of 2018, you'll find my Mert tale, The Book That Talked Back, up at the DM's Guild, wherein everyone's favorite fat, wheezing old moneylender journeys to Durlusk in the Border Kingdoms. And I did a 5th edition D&D role-playing adventure to go with it, The Haunted Tomes of Durlusk. Joining both of them on the DM's Guild is our contest winner, Clinton Kronk. His 5th edition D&D role-playing adventure, Rattle the Saber, Shake the Spear.
March and April will see the relaunch of Storm Talons, our epic fantasy setting. More details to come.
Yes, more details to come.
September and October will host the return of Demons, or Daemons, with Helma.
And, over the course of 2018, me. That's right, verse. My own special little corner of the internet. So all year long, we will be having contests, special readings, and online events to celebrate, culminating in some very special appearances and goings-on at GameholeCon in November of 2018.
And to give you, our devoted tag viewers, a sneak peek into next year, we're offering a buy one, get one free. Buy The Whispering Skull by Ed Greenwood in any format on Onder Emporium and get his brand new adventure, The Haunted Tombs of Durlusk, absolutely free.
This offer is only valid till Friday, December 15th, so take advantage while you can.
This adventure has only been played by a select few at Gamehole Con and is not available anywhere to buy or download. It is exclusively through us until next year. And the only way to get it is to buy a copy of The Whispering Skull and get it for free. No coupon code necessary. Just add The Whispering Skull to your cart and the adventure will be added to your cart automatically. You literally cannot find this anywhere else. Surprise your Forgotten Realms friends with an all-new Ed Greenwood adventure to run during the holidays.
Already bought The Whispering Skull? No problem. Just go to the Onder Emporium and use the Contact Us form to tell us. Be sure to include the email address you used to purchase your copy. Once we receive it, we can send you your free copy of The Haunted Tomes of Durlusk.
And that's all from us this week. Goodbye for now.
Farewell from Teg, until next time.